There are days you remember for the rest of your life. The day you left home. The day you fell in love. The day your child was born. The day someone you loved didn't come back. Some days arrive carrying their importance. You can feel them approaching. A wedding marked on the calendar, a hospital appointment circled in red, an envelope waiting to be opened. But the days that change everything rarely announce themselves. They begin quietly, with alarms, traffic, half-finished cups of coffee, and people rushing through ordinary moments, completely unaware that they are ordinary for the final time. And then there was Tuesday. Sarah Mitchell opened her eyes at 6:17 a.m. and immediately knew she had overslept. She didn't need to check the clock. She could tell by the light spilling through the curtains, by the silence in the hallway, and by the feeling that the morning had already moved on without her. Her alarm had stopped ringing long ago. It had simply given up. She reached for her phone. 6:17. No. No. Her feet hit the floor before she was fully awake. One sock, no slippers. She hurried into the hallway and nearly tripped over a school bag. Eli? No answer. Lily? Still nothing. In the kitchen, chaos had already begun. Eli stood on a chair, reaching into the cereal cupboard, while Lily sat at the table wearing fairy wings instead of her school uniform. Milk covered half the counter, a spoon lay on the floor, and the dog was happily licking toast crumbs beneath the table. Sarah closed her eyes for a single breath before launching into the familiar rhythm of another rushed school morning. Lunch boxes, toast, fruit, drinks, permission slips, missing muesli bars, forgotten homework. Everything at once. On top of the refrigerator sat a glass jar labeled Camping Adventure, decorated with crooked drawings of stars and trees. She had promised the children they would finally go this weekend. She wanted this promise to be different from all the others. Across the city, Ben Lawson sat surrounded by textbooks after another sleepless night preparing for his final exams. His room looked like a battlefield of flashcards, coffee cups, and university brochures. His parents reminded him that no exam could define his future, but Ben wasn't convinced. Elsewhere, Arthur Bell quietly poured 2 cups of tea before realizing, once again, that only one of them would ever be drunk. He carried the second cup to the window, overlooking the lemon tree his late wife had planted decades earlier. Some habits survived grief. Some mornings, his hands still remembered the life they once shared. Across town, Mia Chen checked the engagement ring hidden inside her handbag for what felt like the 100th time. Tonight was supposed to be perfect. The restaurant was booked. The photographer was ready. The speech had been rehearsed countless times. By 8:34 p.m., she planned to ask Lauren to spend the rest of her life with her. The city continued waking. Sarah drove the children towards school. Ben boarded the morning train. Arthur wandered to the cemetery to visit June. Mia bought 2 coffees on her way to work. For a few brief moments, their lives brushed against one another without any of them noticing. At exactly 8 a.m., every phone vibrated. Every television froze. Every computer screen went black. Schools, hospitals, offices, trains and homes fell silent. The same message appeared everywhere. You have 24 hours remaining. Sarah blinked once. then again. The words refused to disappear. You have 24 hours remaining. Her first instinct wasn't fear. It was annoyance. Another school notification, she thought. Another broken app. She tapped the screen. Nothing happened. The message remained. She pressed the home button, then the power button. Every icon had vanished. There was only the message. Lily tugged gently on her sleeve. "Mum?" Sarah barely looked up. "What is it?" Lily wasn't looking at Sarah anymore. She was staring at the phone. "My iPad said that too." Sarah frowned. "What?" "The same words." For the first time, Sarah looked around. A father at the crossing held his phone out in front of him. A teacher had stopped walking. The crossing supervisor had lowered her whistle. Nobody seemed to know what to do next. The school bell rang exactly on time. Children instinctively walked toward their classrooms, laughing and talking as though nothing had happened. Adults didn't move. It felt as if the world had paused but forgotten to tell the children. On the train, Ben let out a short laugh through his nose. "Very funny," he muttered. The student beside him looked over. "What?" Ben turned his screen around. The student's expression changed instantly. "I've got that too." Across the carriage, another passenger stood abruptly. Someone dropped their phone. A baby began crying near the rear doors. The train continued moving, but nobody inside it seemed capable of doing the same. Arthur adjusted his glasses and read the message a second time. Then a third. He looked behind the phone, half expecting to find someone playing an elaborate joke. "Well," he murmured. "That's different." He tried switching the phone off. Nothing. He smiled faintly toward June's headstone. "Any idea what this one's about?" A jacaranda flower drifted onto the grass between them. Mia stared at her screen, then laughed quietly to herself. "Marketing," she whispered. "It's got to be marketing." She refreshed the phone again and again, but the message never changed. She looked up and realized every passenger in the carriage was doing exactly the same thing. Refresh. Wait. Refresh. Wait. The silence inside the train became heavier with every passing second. Then every phone vibrated again. Not with another message, just one short vibration. It felt less like a notification and more like an acknowledgement, as though something, somewhere, knew the message had been received. The train rolled into Central Station. Usually, passengers were already standing before the doors opened. This morning, nobody moved. The doors slid apart. People on the platform weren't boarding either. They stood frozen, staring at their own glowing screens. The conductor tried to make an announcement. Only static answered. A little girl on the platform looked up at her mother and asked a question nobody else could find the courage to say aloud. "Mummy, what's remaining?" Nobody answered her. Across the city, thousands of strangers stood in perfect silence, connected not by understanding, but by the same impossible sentence glowing in the palms of their hands. For exactly 1 minute, the world forgot how to be ordinary. The first person to speak wasn't a politician. It wasn't a scientist. It wasn't a news presenter. It was a teenager. Standing in the middle of Central Station, he laughed loudly enough for half the platform to hear. Someone's hacked everything. For a brief moment, people wanted him to be right. Laughter spread through the crowd, not because anyone found it funny, but because humor felt safer than silence. A woman rolled her eyes and slipped her phone back into her handbag. "Probably another AI stunt," she muttered. Someone else blamed a software update. Another guessed it was a promotion for a new television series. Ordinary explanations arrived faster than extraordinary ones. People wanted reality to remain ordinary. Reality simply wasn't cooperating. Sarah knelt in front of Lily. "Sweetheart, go with your teacher." "But Mum, I'll pick you up this afternoon. You promise?" Sarah smiled. "I promise." Lily nodded and disappeared through the school gate. Eli lingered. "Mum." "Yeah? If we've only got 24 hours, Sarah interrupted before he could finish. "We don't." "How do you know?" "Because parents are expected to have answers, even when they don't." Sarah forced another smile. Because messages don't decide how long people live. Eli seemed satisfied. For now. He turned and walked toward his classroom. Only after he disappeared did Sarah look back at her phone. The message was still there. Ben's train finally emptied. Nobody rushed. Normally Central Station moved like a river. This morning it behaved like a lake. People drifted, stopped, compared screens, asked strangers what they were seeing. Every answer was identical. Ben checked the time. 8:07 a.m. His exam began in 53 minutes. For months, it had been the most important thing in his life. Now he wasn't entirely sure it mattered. Arthur remained beside June's grave, sitting quietly on the weathered bench. Around him, visitors slowly reached for their phones. Some frowned. Some shrugged. One elderly couple argued quietly. The husband insisted it was spam. His wife wasn't so sure. Arthur listened without speaking. After nearly 80 years on Earth, he'd learned something curious. The first explanation people choose is almost never the one they keep. Inside the cafe, Mia watched the barista restart the register again and again. The screen displayed only the message. Customers held cash, cards and phones, but nothing worked. Finally, the barista sighed. "You know what? Just take the coffees." Nobody argued. Nobody took more than they ordered. As Mia walked away with her drink, the barista smiled weakly. "I guess today's free." It was the first free coffee Mia had ever received that didn't feel lucky. At 8:11 a.m., the first news bulletin interrupted regular programming. The presenter appeared calm, but only for a moment. "We're receiving reports this morning that electronic devices around the world are displaying the same unexplained message. Authorities are investigating." She glanced down almost instinctively, as if checking her own phone beneath the desk. When she looked back into the camera, her voice remained steady. Her eyes did not. Within minutes, hashtags exploded across social media. Hashtag 24 hours. Hashtag phone message. Hashtag hack. Hashtag countdown. Videos poured in from airports, schools, shopping centers, churches, stadiums, and hospitals. Every screen displayed the same sentence. No edits, no tricks, no explanation. Sarah sat in her car and called work. The line rang several times before someone answered. "Hi, it's Sarah." A pause. "You got it too?" Sarah closed her eyes. "Yeah." Neither of them knew what to say next. Ben arrived outside the examination hall. Hundreds of students stood together. Not one of them was talking about mathematics anymore. Arthur brushed a jacaranda flower from his jacket and looked toward June's headstone. "Well, June, if the world's ending, it's making quite a fuss about it." Mia stopped outside her office building. Nobody was going inside. People simply stood on the footpath looking up, not because there was anything in the sky, but because everyone else was looking too. Sometimes fear spreads without words. All it needs is someone else searching for something you can't see. By 8:15 a.m., the world still hadn't ended. No buildings had collapsed, no earthquakes shook the ground. Traffic lights continued changing, birds continued singing, coffee continued steaming. Life appeared completely normal, which somehow made everything feel even less normal. Every ordinary moment now existed beside one impossible sentence, and humanity began to discover something it had almost forgotten. Not every mystery arrives with noise. Some arrive so quietly that the loudest sound in the world is your own heartbeat. By 8:30, the message had become impossible to ignore. It no longer lived only on phones. It lived in conversations, in worried glances between strangers, and in the uncomfortable silence that followed every attempted explanation. People were still going to work. Schools were still open. Trains still ran on time. Yet every ordinary routine carried an invisible question that nobody wanted to ask aloud. Sarah sat in her parked car outside the school long after the playground had emptied. She should have driven to the office 15 minutes earlier, but her hands refused to leave the steering wheel. She opened the gallery on her phone out of habit. It wouldn't load. Only the message remained. She closed her eyes and pictured Eli and Lily laughing around a campfire that had never happened. "This weekend," she whispered to herself. The words suddenly sounded much heavier than they had yesterday. Ben entered the examination hall with hundreds of other students. Normally, invigilators fought to keep whispers to a minimum. Today, nobody needed reminding to stay quiet. Exam papers sat face down on every desk, while students stared at frozen phone screens hidden beneath their tables. Finally, the chief supervisor walked to the front of the room. "Until we receive further instruction, today's examination is postponed." Relief washed across the room, but it didn't last. Without the exam to worry about, everyone returned to worrying about the message instead. Arthur decided not to go straight home. Instead, he wandered through the local park where parents pushed prams and children chased pigeons exactly as they had every other Tuesday morning. He watched them for several minutes before sitting on a weathered bench. He realized something curious. Nobody was looking at the trees anymore. Everybody was looking at each other, searching every passing face for reassurance that simply wasn't there. Mia finally reached her office building. The lobby was full, but nobody had gone upstairs. Colleagues who barely spoke outside meetings now stood together comparing theories. A cyber attack, artificial intelligence, foreign governments, religious prophecy. Each explanation sounded convincing for about 30 seconds before collapsing under its own weight. Nobody could explain how every device on Earth could display the same message at exactly the same moment. At 8:42 a.m., airlines began reporting delays as flight crews refused to depart until more information became available. Hospitals continued operating, but waiting rooms grew quieter than anyone had ever known. Teachers abandoned lesson plans in favor of reassuring frightened children. Around the world, millions of tiny decisions quietly began reshaping the day. Social media continued moving faster than any newsroom could follow. Every minute brought thousands of new videos. Some people laughed, some cried, some prayed, live to millions of viewers. Others proposed marriage, apologized to estranged family members, or simply sat in silence while strangers watched. Humanity had never experienced the same moment together before. The internet, for perhaps the first time in history, wasn't arguing. It was searching. Sarah's phone rang. It was her sister. Neither of them greeted the other. "Have you seen it?" Sarah answered softly. "Yeah." Another pause followed. "Do you think it's real?" Sarah looked back toward the school gates. "I don't know." It was the first honest answer she had given all morning. Ben walked outside into the winter sunlight. For months he had believed his future depended on one examination. Now the future itself felt uncertain. He looked at the students surrounding him. Some were laughing nervously. Others were already calling home. Nobody cared about grades anymore. Arthur stood and continued walking. As he passed the children's playground, he smiled. Their laughter hadn't changed. Whatever was happening to the adults hadn't reached them completely yet. Arthur found unexpected comfort in that thought. Mia reached into her handbag and wrapped her fingers around the engagement ring. She had spent months planning the perfect evening. For the first time, she wondered whether perfection had ever really mattered. Perhaps love wasn't something that belonged on a schedule after all. By 9 o'clock, the world had begun dividing into two groups: those who believed the message meant nothing, and those who couldn't stop wondering what if it meant everything. Between those two possibilities, ordinary life slowly began slipping away. Just after 9 o'clock, something quietly changed. The questions stopped being about the message itself and became questions about life. What if it was true? The thought slipped into conversations almost by accident. People who had spent the morning dismissing the warning found themselves checking the time more often than they cared to admit. Sarah drove away from the school. But instead of turning toward work, she pulled into a quiet park overlooking the river. She called her manager. "I'm sorry," she said. "I don't think I'm coming in today." There was a long silence before the reply came. "Don't worry. Hardly anyone else is either." Sarah thanked her, ended the call, and stared through the windscreen. She realized she could remember every deadline she'd met over the past year, but struggled to remember the last uninterrupted afternoon she'd spent with her children. Ben wandered through the city instead of returning home. His backpack still held textbooks that suddenly felt heavier than ever before. He passed a music busker playing an old acoustic guitar. Usually people hurried by without listening. Today a crowd had formed. Some smiled. Others cried quietly. Ben stood there until the final chord faded into the morning air, applauding with everyone else. For the first time in months, he wasn't thinking about university. He was simply listening. Arthur unlocked the front door to an empty house that no longer felt quite as lonely. He placed the kettle on the stove before catching himself. He smiled gently and filled only one cup. Carrying it into the lounge room, he opened a dusty photo album he hadn't touched in years. Page after page revealed holidays, birthdays, anniversaries, and ordinary afternoons that had somehow become priceless. "We had a good life, didn't we?" he whispered to the photographs. Mia sat alone on a bench outside her office. The engagement ring rested in the palm of her hand. She'd obsessed over choosing the perfect restaurant, the perfect speech, and the perfect moment. Now she wondered whether love had ever required perfection at all. She picked up her phone and called Lauren. The call connected instantly. Neither of them said hello. Lauren spoke first. "Can we spend today together?" Mia smiled through unexpected tears. "I was hoping you'd ask." Across the world, meetings were cancelled. Sporting events paused. Concert rehearsals stopped halfway through songs. Employers sent staff home. Some people ignored the message completely and carried on as though nothing had happened. Others abandoned everything immediately. There was no right answer because nobody knew what question they were really answering. Churches opened their doors early. Beaches filled with families despite it being a weekday. Cafes gave away meals to anyone who needed one. Complete strangers began talking to one another in supermarket queues. It wasn't because humanity had suddenly become kinder. It was because people had started measuring time differently. News presenters continued reporting every update they could find. Yet every broadcast sounded almost identical. There were still no answers. Scientists had no explanation. Governments had no explanation. Technology companies had no explanation. For perhaps the first time in modern history, the entire world shared the same amount of information. Almost none. Sarah arrived back at the school earlier than anyone expected. The office staff looked surprised. "Everything all right?" one teacher asked. Sarah nodded. "I just wanted to have lunch with my kids." She signed them out for the afternoon. Eli grinned. Lily threw her arms around her. "Are we in trouble?" Lily asked. Sarah laughed softly. "Not today." As they walked toward the car, Lily looked up at her mother. "Can we still go camping?" Sarah looked at the clear blue sky above them. "No," she said with a warm smile. "We're going today." In different corners of the city, 4 ordinary lives had begun drifting away from schedules, expectations, and routines. None of them knew whether tomorrow would come. Yet for the first time in a very long time, each of them had begun choosing how to spend today. By midday, the countdown had become invisible, yet everyone carried it with them. Watches still ticked. Phones still displayed the same impossible sentence. Every glance at the time was no longer a habit. It was a calculation. Every passing hour suddenly felt expensive. Sarah drove beyond the edge of the city toward the small national park, where she'd promised to take Eli and Lily for months. The children didn't ask why it was a Tuesday. They didn't ask why Mum wasn't at work. They only cared that she was finally there. Together, they unpacked a faded picnic blanket, chased each other through the grass, and laughed until they forgot about the phone sitting silently inside the car. As they wandered along a walking track, Lily slipped her small hand into Sarah's. "Mum," she asked. "Yeah? Can we do this more often?" Sarah swallowed the lump in her throat before answering. "We should have been doing it all along." Ben caught the train to the beach instead of going home. He hadn't visited since finishing school. Exams had become his whole identity. Sitting on the sand, he watched surfers waiting patiently for waves that couldn't be rushed. Nearby, an elderly man offered him half of a packet of chips without saying a word. Ben accepted with a grateful smile. Strange how quickly strangers stopped feeling like strangers. Arthur drove to the little coastal town where he and June had celebrated their honeymoon almost 50 years earlier. The motel had been replaced by apartments. The cafe had changed names twice, and the old cinema was gone. Yet the ocean sounded exactly the same. He sat overlooking the water and realized that places change far more slowly than people do. Mia met Lauren in the botanical gardens. There was no expensive restaurant, no photographer hiding nearby, no carefully rehearsed speech. They simply walked together beneath the trees. After several quiet minutes, Lauren squeezed Mia's hand. "Whatever this is, I'm glad I'm not facing it alone." Mia stopped walking, reached into her bag, and held out the ring. I was going to wait until tonight. Lauren laughed through tears. You've already made me wait long enough. Not every story was joyful. Across the world, old regrets resurfaced. Brothers who hadn't spoken in years picked up the phone. Parents apologized to children. Children forgave parents. Hospital rooms filled with visitors who had always planned to come tomorrow. Tomorrow had suddenly become too uncertain to rely on. In cities everywhere, traffic eased, parks filled, restaurants gave food away to people who couldn't pay. Street musicians found audiences larger than they'd ever dreamed of. Conversations replaced notifications. Eye contact replaced scrolling. For a few remarkable hours, humanity remembered how to be present. News anchors continued searching for answers, but their broadcasts slowly changed tone. The question was no longer simply what the message meant. It had become what people were choosing to do because of it. Cameras showed families embracing, neighbors introducing themselves for the first time, and communities gathering in public squares without anyone organizing them. As the afternoon sun drifted lower, each of the four strangers unknowingly moved closer to becoming the person they had always hoped to be. Nothing about the countdown had been explained. Yet something undeniable had already happened. The world hadn't stopped. It had finally paused long enough to notice itself. The hours continued disappearing one by one. Whether the message was true or false no longer mattered as much as it had that morning. The choices people made because they believed it were already changing lives forever. As evening settled over the city, conversations grew quieter. The frantic search for answers had slowly given way to acceptance that no answers were coming. The message still glowed on every screen, unchanged since 8 o'clock that morning. It no longer felt like an interruption. It felt like a companion, silently counting every passing minute. Sarah and the children sat beside a small campfire at the edge of the national park. Eli carefully roasted marshmallows, while Lily searched for shapes among the first stars appearing overhead. Sarah watched them both without reaching for her phone once. She realized she had spent years promising herself she would be more present one day. Somehow, it had taken the possibility of losing tomorrow to fully appreciate today. "Mum," Lily whispered, leaning against her shoulder, "can we come back here next weekend?" Sarah looked into the flames before answering. "I'd like that very much." She meant it with every part of her heart. Ben remained on the beach long after the sun had disappeared beneath the horizon. Families packed up their towels. Surfers carried boards back to their cars. An elderly couple walked hand in hand along the shoreline. Ben pulled out his phone and called his parents. When his father answered, Ben didn't talk about exams. He simply said, "I love you." There was silence on the other end before the words came back. "We love you too, son." Arthur returned home just before dusk. He opened the back door and sat beneath the old lemon tree June had planted decades earlier. The scent of citrus drifted through the cool evening air. Looking up at the darkening sky, he smiled gently. "If tonight's the night," he said quietly, "I've been luckier than most." There was no bitterness in his voice, only gratitude. Mia and Lauren abandoned every remaining plan. They ordered takeaway, spread a blanket across their living room floor, and looked through old photographs together. They laughed at terrible hairstyles, remembered forgotten holidays, and retold stories they both knew by heart. Eventually, Mia slipped the ring onto Lauren's finger without speeches or grand gestures. Lauren simply nodded through tears. Nothing more needed to be said. Across the world, candlelight appeared in windows. Churches, mosques, synagogues and temples filled with people seeking peace rather than certainty. Others gathered around dinner tables, hospital beds, park benches and kitchen counters. Some celebrated, some mourned, some sat quietly beside those they loved. Humanity had stopped asking what the message meant and started answering it in the only way it could, by choosing how to spend the hours that remained. News broadcasts continued throughout the evening, though their tone had softened. Reporters no longer chased rumors. Instead, cameras captured acts of kindness unfolding everywhere. Volunteers delivering meals, neighbors meeting for the first time, long-forgotten friendships restored. The story had quietly shifted from fear to humanity. At 11:30 p.m., streets that were normally alive with traffic became strangely peaceful. Many people stepped outside together. Apartment balconies filled. Front lawns became gathering places. Beaches, hills, and rooftops welcomed silent crowds looking toward the same night sky. There was nothing unusual to see above them. Yet nobody wanted to face midnight alone. The clock continued moving with complete indifference. 11:35, 11:42, 11:48. Each minute disappeared forever. Nobody could slow it. Nobody could bargain with it. Four strangers, scattered across the same city, looked toward the same stars without knowing their lives had already become connected. Whatever happened at midnight, they had each rediscovered something the modern world had quietly stolen from them. The courage to stop postponing the people and moments that mattered most. The final half hour had begun. The final 30 minutes passed differently for everyone. Some people watched the clock. Others deliberately turned it away. A few kept talking as though conversation itself could slow time. Across the world, millions of hearts quietly counted down together. Sarah tucked blankets around Eli and Lily as they lay beside the fading campfire. The children had fallen asleep beneath a sky crowded with stars. She sat between them, brushing a strand of hair from Lily's face before looking toward the darkness beyond the trees. Every promise she had postponed echoed through her mind, but tonight there was one promise she was grateful she had finally kept. Ben stood barefoot where the waves met the shore. The cool water rolled over his feet before slipping back into the ocean. He realized the sea had no idea what time it was. The tide continued rising and falling with perfect indifference. For the first time all day, he took a deep breath that wasn't interrupted by fear. Arthur remained beneath the lemon tree, with a warm blanket across his knees. June's wedding ring rested in the palm of his hand. He had carried it ever since the funeral, never quite ready to let it go. Looking toward the stars, he smiled softly. "If you're waiting," he whispered, "I'm not afraid anymore." Mia and Lauren sat on the floor of their apartment with their backs against the couch. Their hands never separated. They spoke about the home they wanted to buy, the children they hoped to raise, and the holidays they still dreamed of taking. Neither of them believed those dreams had disappeared. They simply wanted the other to know them, just in case. Television channels abandoned regular programming. Around the globe, cameras showed skylines, beaches, mountains, and city squares where strangers gathered shoulder to shoulder. Some prayed aloud, others sang quietly. Many simply stood together in silence. Humanity had never shared a single moment quite like this. At 11:58 p.m., conversations began fading away. The last jokes were told. The last embraces lingered a little longer. Phones still displayed the same sentence they had shown all day, but almost nobody looked at them anymore. They were looking at faces instead. The final minute arrived without fanfare. There were no sirens, no thunder, no strange lights crossing the sky. Only the ordinary sounds of a world holding its breath. Wind through trees, waves against the shore, a kettle whistling somewhere, a child laughing in the distance before being gently hugged a little tighter. Sarah held both of her children close. Ben closed his eyes and listened to the ocean. Arthur slipped June's ring back onto his finger one final time. Mia rested her head against Lauren's shoulder. 4 strangers, 1 city, 1 impossible promise. 10 seconds remained. Nobody counted aloud. The numbers lived silently inside every heart. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Midnight arrived. Nothing happened. The stars remained exactly where they had always been. The ocean continued reaching for the shore. The wind still rustled through the leaves. Somewhere a dog barked. Someone laughed nervously. Someone else cried with relief. The silence broke one breath at a time as people slowly realized they were still here. Then, almost together, billions of phones vibrated one last time. Every phone vibrated at exactly the same moment. Hands that had only just begun to relax reached instinctively for glowing screens once more. Across beaches, living rooms, hospital wards, rooftops and quiet country roads, billions of people held their breath as a second message slowly appeared. There were only 7 words. Thank you for remembering how to live. No countdown followed. No explanation. No signature. Just those 7 words, sitting quietly beneath the first message before both dissolved together. For the first time in 16 hours, every screen returned to normal. Clocks reappeared. Photos returned. Messages flooded in. The world had its technology back. What it couldn't immediately recover was the version of itself that had existed yesterday morning. Nobody ever discovered where the messages came from. Scientists searched for evidence. Governments launched investigations. Technology companies examined every network on Earth. Historians compared ancient records. Philosophers debated. Religious leaders reflected. Years passed, yet no explanation ever satisfied everyone. Eventually, humanity accepted something it had always struggled to accept. Not every mystery exists to be solved. Sarah drove home the following afternoon after a real camping trip that had lasted barely 24 hours. Eli slept against the car window, while Lily clutched a small collection of pine cones she insisted were treasures. Sarah smiled as she glanced in the rearview mirror. On Monday morning, she submitted a request to reduce her working hours. The promotion she had once chased no longer mattered as much as the people waiting at home. Ben sat his postponed examination several weeks later. He still studied hard, but success no longer defined his worth. He joined a local surf club, called his parents more often, and discovered that the future he feared losing had actually become larger than the one he had planned. Arthur returned to June's grave, carrying only 1 cup of tea. He smiled as he placed it beside the headstone. "I think I'm ready now," he whispered. He finally slipped her wedding ring into the soil beneath the lemon tree she had loved. Not as a goodbye, but as a thank you for a lifetime that had already been enough. Mia and Lauren married the following spring in a small garden surrounded by family and friends. There were no extravagant decorations and no perfect timetable. Their favorite photograph from the day wasn't taken during the ceremony. It was the quiet moment beforehand, when they looked at each other and laughed for no reason at all. The world slowly returned to normal. Traffic returned. Deadlines returned. Emails returned. The noise returned. But not completely. Parks stayed a little busier. Family dinners lasted a little longer. Old friends called each other more often. Parents looked up from their phones more frequently. For a while at least, people remembered that tomorrow had never been guaranteed, even before the message appeared. Some dismissed the entire event as an elaborate global experiment. Others believed it had been a miracle. Many never spoke about it again. Yet almost everyone could point to one decision they had made during those 24 hours that quietly changed the rest of their life. Perhaps that had been the point all along, not to frighten humanity with the possibility of death, but to remind it of the privilege of being alive. And maybe the greatest tragedy had never been that our days were numbered. It had been living as though they weren't. If you woke tomorrow believing you had only one day left, who would you call? Where would you go? What would you finally say? More importantly, if those answers matter tomorrow, why don't they matter today? The next morning arrived like every morning before it. Alarms rang. Coffee brewed. Children laughed on their way to school. Birds welcomed the sunrise without knowing they had witnessed history. The world continued turning, exactly as it always had. The difference wasn't the world, it was the people living in it. If this story stayed with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What would you do if you truly believed you had just 24 hours left? Leave your answer in the comments below. If you're enjoying Fractured Realities, consider subscribing and joining us as we explore more impossible questions that reveal something deeply human. Until next time, in this reality and the next, never stop chasing the fractures.